This programme asks plain questions with the help of the unrivalled range of BBC journalists right across the world. And gathered here in this building, I'll also draw my time reporting on global conflict. Frontline experience that helps me know who to talk to and who to listen to, meaning our analysis is unbiased with absolutely no spin.
Unspun World. Watch on BBC iPlayer.
The 2024 US election looks set to be one of the most extraordinary yet. Could there be further shocks ahead in this historic race to the White House? Get the latest headlines in the BBC News app. Get in-depth coverage on bbc.co.uk/news. Follow the story of the US election on BBC News.
At 10, a surprise fall in inflation prompts predictions that interest rates could be cut not once, but twice by the end of the year. Inflation fell to 1.7% last month, helped by cheaper fuel and airfares. It could be good news for mortgage holders, but raises concerns for some of Britain's poorest families. We'll explain why. Also tonight, the inquest into the deaths of 4 teenagers who drowned when their car overturned. One mother calls for a change in law for new young drivers.
Unfortunately, Harvey and the boys' story is not unique. Almost 5,000 people a year are affected by a death or seriously injured as a result of a young driver.
A 7-year-old boy is killed in an explosion in Newcastle. 6 others are taken to hospital. 8 trucks head into northern Gaza amid dire warnings at the UN about the humanitarian situation there. And who's won this year's RIBA Award for the UK's best architecture? We will be revealing all.
On Newsnight at 10:30 tonight, we'll bring you fresh insight on the stories of the day with big interviews and our regular panel of Newsnighters. And of course, look at what the papers are saying about tomorrow's news.
Good evening. Inflation fell by far more than expected last month, down to 1.7%, the lowest rate in 3.5 years. City analysts are now predicting that the Bank of England could cut interest rates twice by Christmas. The lower than expected inflation rate has also sparked concerns about the impact on some of Britain's poorest families. Our economics editor, Faisal Islam, is here to explain. Faisal.
Thanks, Sophie. A good news surprise for the economy as airline fares and fuel prices actually fell. It could mean a softer landing for the UK economy from this giant hump of inflation, going to double digits as the economy was hit by multiple global crises. Well, in September, the pace of price rises has slowed to its lowest rate in 3 years. In fact, to below the Bank of England's target of 2% at 1.7%. And perhaps the biggest consequence for you of today's inflation figures is on interest rates. It helps the people at the Bank of England go for rate cuts probably faster now than expected, with markets expecting 2 cuts this year from this rate of 5% down to 4.5% by the end of the year. But that high inflation shock has left a permanent scar on the cost of living, a higher level of everyday prices over the past 3 years. At this food pantry in Liverpool, weekly food baskets are subsidised. Workers and customers alike say the need is still high and increases in benefits don't make up for it.
Our money hasn't increased. So it may not be in a cost of living crisis anymore officially, but at ground zero, we are still in that crisis.
The shops, prices going sky high. What can 2% do, really? Not much.
There's a direct impact of today's inflation number on benefits and tax credits. It normally sets next April's increase, so up 1.7%. That compares to the state pension going up 4.1% under the more generous triple lock policy. For a typical adult universal credit recipient, that's about £7 a month extra, whereas a single pensioner under the triple lock gets £39 extra a month under the full new state pension. The overall benefits bill is one of the types of spending under pressure ahead of the budget. The minister in charge especially wants to rein in the ballooning cost of people too sick to work.
I want to see those costs coming down because I want to have people able to work, to get on in their work, which is good for them, it's good for companies too.
All this ahead of a tough budget. The mood music from the Treasury is of a bigger budget hole than expected, approaching £40 billion a year.
Faisal is with me now. £40 billion black hole. We've been hearing 22 billion until recently. Explain the difference.
It's a very good question. This is not being sort of publicly referred to, this 40 billion number. It's essentially the 22 billion plus an account of what the Treasury thinks it would take to get spending back to normal. The previous governments made a set of assumptions that this government thinks were unrealistic about public spending in a range of departments. And to get that back up to what they think is par, normal, standard for public services, that is what we are talking about. And that would be the gap that would have to be raised by taxes because they're not allowed to borrow money for this day-to-day spending. So that's what we're talking about. And I think the consequence of all of that is what we're seeing tonight at the Treasury, a big deadline, the major measures deadline. All the big items in the budget have to be signed off tonight to be sent to the official forecaster. And that means sort of knife-edge negotiations with big government departments, a series of letters being sent with some of those cabinet ministers not so happy with some of their tight spending. But the Treasury adamant that their budget will mean tough spending settlements, tough on welfare and some tax rises too. Our
economics editor Faisal Islam, thank you. Well, Victoria Derbyshire will be looking ahead to the budget on Newsnight on BBC 2 at 10:30. She joins us now, Victoria.
Yeah, absolutely, because tonight Cabinet sources are telling Newsnight about deep unease over the scale of spending cuts in some government departments in Rachel Reeves' first budget. Our team will talk about what that could mean for you. And could weight loss drugs like Ozempic help save the NHS, quote unquote? Newsnight on BBC 2, BBC News and iPlayer in about 25 minutes. See you then.
Victoria, thank you. The mother of a teenager who died with 3 friends when their car overturned in North Wales has called for the law to be changed to stop young newly qualified drivers carrying passengers. The inquest into their deaths heard that the car came off the road and landed in a flooded ditch. All 4 boys, who were sixth form college students from Shrewsbury, drowned. From the inquest, our Wales correspondent Hal Griffith reports.
The sharp, sweeping bend where, last November, 4 lives ended suddenly when a car left the road. 16-year-old Jevon Hurst, Harvey Owen and Will Fitchard, both 17, and 18-year-old Hugo Morris were college friends who'd come to North Wales for a weekend in the mountains. When the boys didn't arrive home, a search was launched. Their car was eventually spotted overturned in a flooded ditch 2 days after it had crashed.
The conditions on that day were wet, there were leaves on the road, but a crash investigator told the inquest that the accident had been avoidable. He believed the driver, Hugo Morris, had been going around the bend too quickly and lost control, even though he was well below the speed limit of 60 miles an hour.
Harvey Owen's mother told the inquest her son had been flourishing in life, loving music and playing his guitar. She believes young drivers shouldn't be allowed to carry passengers of the same age and wants licensing laws changed.
I will miss him every second of every day and ache to see his beautiful face, to hear his soft and gentle voice and feel his warm embrace for the rest of my life. But it will give me reassurance that my girls will be less at risk and will help stop so many of these preventable deaths and save other people having to live with this pain.
After the accident, vigils were held to remember the 4 boys. Their deaths struck a chord with families across the UK. Today, the coroner said she too was worried about the laws for young drivers and their passengers and would write to the Department of Transport to raise her concerns. Hywel Griffith, BBC News, Caernarfon.
A jury has been told that a 10-year-old girl who allegedly died at the hands of relatives she was living with had more than 70 new external injuries when her body was found. Sarah Sharif was also found with internal injuries and wounds inflicted before the assault, which led to her death at the family home in Woking in Surrey last year. Her father, stepmother and uncle have all denied murder. A 7-year-old boy has died following an explosion at a house in Newcastle in the early hours of this morning. 3 houses, which were divided into flats, have been destroyed. 6 people have been taken to hospital and a number of others have been evacuated from their homes. Fiona Trott reports.
It used to be a family home. This is all that's left. An empty space at the heart of a city centre community. They were woken by this. A huge fire that forced people out of their homes. Neighbours described what they saw.
Just a big flash. I'm thinking it's the explosion in the windows, and after that all the fire is go outside. And after that, I'm thinking it's the car or something, but after that is the smell. I wake up all the house. It's massive shock.
Then, at lunchtime, the news they all feared. A 7-year-old boy had died.
It is with great sadness that I stand in front of you today following the tragic death of a young child. An investigation is ongoing to establish how the explosion occurred. We will continue to piece together what has happened so we can provide answers to the family as well as the wider community.
This has been really upsetting for everybody here. The idea of a family asleep and a little boy losing his life in an explosion overnight. It was soon declared a major incident involving specialist teams. Search and rescue workers have been here throughout the day. Gas engineers have been working here too, helping the police and fire service with their investigations, which will continue for some time. How did this happen? It's something everybody here is asking about and worrying about and having to explain to their own children tonight. Fiona Trott, BBC News, Newcastle.
The US envoy to the United Nations says Washington is watching Israel's actions on the ground in northern Gaza to make sure it's not pursuing what she called a policy of starvation there. It follows widespread claims that the Israeli military is besieging parts of the north and preventing food aid getting through. Israel denies it's blocking aid and says 50 trucks arrived in northern Gaza today. The US has threatened to cut military supplies unless more aid is allowed through. Israel is not allowing international journalists, including the BBC, independent access to Gaza. Fergal Keane reports now from Jerusalem, a warning his report contains graphic images that may be distressing from the very start.
Not a burden, but a duty. To the dead and those left after them. They'd fled here hoping it might be safer. In Gaza City, 13 members of the same family killed by an Israeli airstrike.
I took out my younger brother at the last moment. He told me, I heard Mum and Dad reciting a prayer. I don't know how we can go back to our home in the north without my mother or father or brothers.
The Abu Nasser family were from Jabalia. This is what they fled from. A brother mourns his sister. It's a horrible crime here, says the civil defence officer. Many dead are being pulled out of homes and from the streets. Jabalia is cut off by the Israeli army fighting Hamas. But the horrors being endured here are emerging. They run to save life and because they fear airstrikes. Bodies piled into ambulances. All ages. Kamal Adwan Hospital in Jabalia is facing a constant stream of casualties. There is a dire humanitarian crisis. Israel is accused of refusing or impeding up to 90% of aid to northern Gaza in the last month. From Jerusalem, I spoke by phone with the hospital director. What is the situation now for you in the hospital?
We are talking about collective punishment for the health system in the Gaza Strip. Consequently, we urge the world to intervene and impose their humanity over the Israeli army, to open humanitarian corridors that allow the entrance of medical tools, delegations, fuel and food, so that we can provide humanitarian services for the children, newborn babies and patients who are in need.
America has warned Israel it may cut arms if it doesn't boost the aid allowed into northern Gaza. Israel says it's addressing US concerns. And its soldiers blame Hamas for the crisis facing civilians, saying medical facilities are used to launch attacks.
הכל כאן זה ניצול ציני של האוכלוסייה האזרחית בתוך מרפאה, בתוך מתחם אזרחי. אנחנו נרדוף את המחבלים האלה ונמצא אותם בכל פינה.
In Gaza City, they're digging for the dead. What a child must witness. They desperately want this to stop. But no, they cannot make it happen. Fergal Keane, BBC News, Jerusalem.
Well, as Fergal said, aid is desperately needed in Gaza, but how much is actually getting through, and is it reaching the people who need it the most? Nick Eardley from BBC Verify is here with us now. Nick.
Thanks, Sophie. The United Nations has published figures showing aid trucks it's observed crossing into Gaza, and the changes have been quite significant. You can see them here. Before the conflict, it was around 500 trucks per day. But if we focus in on the last year, the number of trucks increases gradually, as you can see here, up to March when around 5,000 crossed into Gaza. That's around 170 a day. But then, since then, there's been a big fall, and at the start of this month, the fall was huge. That equates to just 13 trucks per day. The UN also looked at the population of Gaza, just over 2 million people, and found that 96% of them were facing crisis levels of food insecurity or worse. Now, this map, which we're going to show you, shows the key entry points for aid in the last year. But let's focus in on one, the Rafah crossing down here. The majority of aid was delivered here early in the conflict. You can see satellite pictures. This is from November last year, and you can see all the infrastructure around the crossing there. But this is what it looks like now. This is from a few weeks ago, and as you can see, all the buildings have been flattened after Israel's military offensive in the area. The Rafah crossing has now been closed since the start of May. No aid is getting through. Now, in the past few days, since the US sent that letter raising concerns about the aid situation, there has been evidence of some aid passing into Gaza. This video, which we're showing you, was posted today by Israel, saying that 50 trucks had crossed into northern Gaza from Jordan. Israel's also highlighted dozens of other trucks crossing in recent days. They're said to have included things like food, hygiene products, baby formula and shelter equipment. Israel also denies preventing the entry of humanitarian aid into Gaza, but as we know, the US, the UN and many others have real concerns about what isn't getting through. Sophie.
Nick Eardley, thank you. Israel has carried out dozens of airstrikes in Hezbollah-dominated areas of southern Lebanon and the capital, Beirut. The attacks killed the mayor and 15 others and injured more than 50. The Lebanese government has accused the world of being silent in the face of attacks on civilians. Rescuers have also been searching for survivors today in the town of Kana, where, according to local officials, Israeli bombardment killed 7 overnight. Israel's military says it killed a local Hezbollah commander. Our senior international correspondent Ola Girin sent this report from Beirut.
Terror from the skies. My God, what have they done, he says. They've destroyed Nabatea. Then one more Israeli airstrike. Carpet bombing a city that's still home to about 1,200 people. Ahmed Khel, on the left, is the mayor who stayed to look after them until his last breath. He was pro-Hezbollah, but he was a civilian. The mayor was killed here in the municipality building with 5 others from his crisis unit. They were meeting about aid, according to the Lebanese government. Israel says it struck dozens of Hezbollah targets in Nabatea. A UN official says it killed 4 members of a relief team the UN worked with for more than a year. And 1 hour away, this was the picture in Qana. The name might be familiar. Israel killed at least 100 civilians here when it shelled a UN compound in 1996. It bombed the town again in 2006. In every war, we get our share of devastation, says the mayor here, Mohammed Kershet. Today, the destruction is massive, terrifying. We still have missing people trapped under the rubble. And there is so much rubble now. Israel admits causing all this and says it eliminated the local commander of Hezbollah. The army published this video today showing its bombardment of southern Lebanon in what Israel calls a war of self-defense. Orla Gearan, BBC News, Beirut.
To Ukraine now, and the US President Joe Biden has announced a new $425 million military aid package for Ukraine tonight. The White House says it includes defence capability, air-to-ground munitions and armoured vehicles. It comes after Ukraine's president presented a so-called victory plan to his parliament that he said would be enough to end the war with Russia. The two sides have been at war for more than 2.5 years now, and fierce fighting continues in the east of Ukraine. President Zelensky told his parliament the way to end the war was for NATO to invite Ukraine to become a member, and he said Ukraine's allies must end restrictions on long-range strikes on Russia.
For decades, Russia was using the geopolitical uncertainty in Europe and the fact that Ukraine is not a NATO member as a factor to challenge our safety. A Ukraine invitation to NATO is fundamental to peace.
Well, our correspondent James Waterhouse joins us now from Kyiv, and let's talk about that military aid package. How much difference could that make?
It's central, Sophie, to Ukraine's continued war effort. We're talking about $425 million in a latest package from Ukraine's biggest ally, but it's what's going to follow which the White House is keen to talk up. It's clear the outgoing Biden administration is looking to give Ukraine as much as help as possible to get it all signed off in the weeks and months ahead. That includes thousands of armoured vehicles, personnel carriers, artillery ammunition, air defence systems and rockets as well. And that will be central to Ukraine's continued survival in the eyes of President Zelensky. Today was a day when you think about how Ukraine is being impacted by a controversial mobilisation law, Russia's ongoing invasion, a mounting death toll. It was expected by some that he would announce some concessions he'd be willing to make in his vision for peace. But there was no such concession announced. In fact, he doubled down. He elaborated on how he wanted his military to be further strengthened. And this plan is only as good as how Western allies receive it. He's going to present it to European Union leaders tomorrow. He's had a call with President Joe Biden this evening where that military aid package was announced. But crucially, this victory plan, as he calls it, it's all on what the next US president makes of it. These are deeply uncertain times for Ukraine, and Russia has dismissed his vision today.
James Waterhouse in Kyiv, thank you. Here, police and retailers are warning that organised gangs behind the recent rise in shoplifting are using more sophisticated tactics to steal on a large scale. A BBC News investigation has gained exclusive access to the work of one organisation that tracks the criminals for some of the biggest retailers in the country. Jim Connolly has the story.
Marauding gangs, violent tactics, but the reality is often much more sneaky. Gangs evolving, going under the radar. We're told this woman wears a fat suit to sneak out more items. Organised crime gangs fueling the rise in shoplifting. The crime adds more than £100 to a family's shopping bill each year. To get a sense of the scale of the problem and how these gangs operate, we've been given exclusive access to the workings of an organisation that follow these gangs for some of the biggest shops in the country.
So we are currently tracking 63 organised gangs across the UK who are responsible for £2.4 million worth of theft over a 5-year period that we know of. That's just the tip of the iceberg.
And we're going to focus on one gang. What are they called?
Well, we call them the Champagne Gang because they steal champagne. So they operate right across the UK, but they're actually from Eastern Europe.
This is really organised, isn't it?
It is really organised. It's a mafia-style operation.
Sarah then talked me through one location the gang hit.
OK, let's have a look at Harrogate in North Yorkshire.
And you're going to bring up some of the offenders now. Talk us through what we know about these guys.
7 individuals here. One of them was actually one of the original key members of the team.
The fact that it's 7 and not the usual smaller group, what do you think's happening here?
We believe that they've used this specific hit as a training day for their new recruits to show them the ropes, you know, do a bit of schooling and then set them to work.
What Sarah sees happens all over the country. Here in Beverley in East Yorkshire, gangs have been terrifying shop workers.
They came around the counter, swiping this shelf and the shelf at the bottom there, barging customers and staff out the way.
Sarah says the same gang targeted another of their stores in York on the same afternoon, but nobody was arrested.
Very, very frustrating. Why are forces not talking to each other or have a unit that supports this?
Would you be surprised to know that there is actually a scheme out there that the government brought in with police forces to do just that, to coordinate and try and break down these gangs?
Wow, why didn't we know? Why did we not know that this was supposed to be going on?
I've been looking into shoplifting now for over a year, and in that time the frustration of people like Sarah continues to grow. And now it's a frustration combined with apathy, with many shops simply not reporting the crime because they don't think the police will do anything about it. And that is why this is becoming a really stubborn problem for the authorities to crack down on. The government is promising action in the form of more police on patrol, and the National Police Chiefs Council told us there is more work to do, but insists it's taken leaps and strides in the right direction. Jim Connolly, BBC News.
The man picked to lead the England men's football team into the 2026 World Cup is the German former Chelsea manager, Thomas Tuchel. He says he's very proud to take on the job and is focused on making the dream come true for England fans. The 51-year-old has an 18-month contract to manage the team. Prince William, who's president of the Football Association, called his appointment exciting. Our sports editor, Dan Rowan, reports. Now look at these lines, this architecture. It is the Elizabeth line, the purple line, hence the colour here. And it has just been named the winner of this year's Sterling Prize for the UK's best new architecture. The track is 62 miles long. It runs from Reading right across London to Abbey Wood in the east and has 10 new and 31 upgraded stations along the way. 200 million passengers are expected to use it every year. And if you want to continue watching the BBC News at 10, please turn over to BBC One, or you can watch on iPlayer. Next, it's Newsnight.
Deep unease and a nightmare. Cabinet sources tell Newsnight of anxiety over budget spending cuts. And this woman lost 11 stone using weight loss drugs like Ozempic. We'll talk to her and the Oxford economist who thinks such drugs could help save the NHS. Hello, welcome to Newsnight Live, each weeknight with interviews and insight. Your panellists this evening are Labour MP Rosanna Allen-Khan, who is also an A&E doctor, welcome to you, and former Conservative MP and ex-Minister Steve Baker, welcome to you. Right, the budget is 2 weeks today. Last night, Nick reported that the Chancellor Rachel Reeves is looking to make tax rises and spending cuts to the value of £40 billion. Tonight, Nick, you've been picking up what we might describe as a darkening mood in the Cabinet over spending cuts. Ben Chew is also here. The old band is back together. Ben is BBC Verify's policy correspondent. Nick, what are people saying to you, first of all?
Well, Vic, it's clearly a very grim mood around the Cabinet table 2 weeks away from that budget. And the sort of language I'm hearing from Cabinet sources are things like, it's an effing nightmare. I'm also hearing language about how some Cabinet ministers, as it was put to me, are being a little bit antsy. So this all kicked off this afternoon when Bloomberg reported that some Cabinet ministers who have real concerns about what might be going on and what sort of cuts they might be facing wrote to the Prime Minister to raise their concerns. It looks like we have one united theme around the Cabinet table, which is this is absolutely awful. And then ministers split it roughly into two sorts of groups. There are those who are saying it's a terrible challenge, but we understand the pressure that the Chancellor is under. Then there are other ministers who are really concerned, and it's not sort of difficult to work out who they are. They're in the so-called unprotected departments. Their budgets are not protected. Not rocket science to work out who we're talking about. Angela Rayner, Housing and Local Government. Shabana Mahmood, Justice, and Lou Haig, Transport. Not saying they wrote letters, but they're the ministers who would be worried. So it all came to a head in the last few hours when the Treasury agreed the final spending settlements for departments from next April for another year. So it's the 2025 to 2026 settlement. That was agreed in the last few hours. The reason why that has to be done then is because tomorrow is the deadline for it to go to the Office for Budget Responsibility. That is called the Major Settlements 2 process. Then in the days before the budget, the Office for Budget Responsibility will come back to the Chancellor with their fiscal forecast, and that will identify, Ben will know all about this, what's called fiscal headroom. Yeah. How much spare money is there? How could she maybe not raise taxes quite so much, not cut spending quite so much? And just to get an idea of the atmosphere, this is the sort of the view of people who are on the sort of the Rachel Reeves, Keir Starmer side of the table, talking about how some Cabinet ministers are being antsy, but they basically understand it all. They've done their settlements, and then just wait for this, they are going to have to suck it up.
Right. Ben, can you explain to our audience where this 40 billion figure has suddenly come from?
Yeah, well, we've had quite a lot of confusing numbers thrown around. Remember the £22 billion black hole? Now we've got a £40 billion tax and spending package. I think the easiest way, Vic, to conceptualise it is to think about the spending pressures on this government. And the Institute for Fiscal Studies laid this out quite recently, showing what they were. And look at that, £9 billion, that's the public sector pay deal that they did. Yep. That's pressure. £5 billion, that was in the Labour manifesto. That's things like free school breakfast clubs. That adds up to £5 billion a year. And Rachel Reeves, remember, said she didn't want austerity to come back to the public sector. So on those unprotected departments that Nick was talking about, if they wanted to keep those budgets flat in inflation-adjusted terms, that would cost £16 billion a year. But if they wanted to keep those budgets flat as a share of GDP, which is one definition probably a more realistic definition, actually, of ending austerity. Look at that. That would cost about £17 billion a year. And all that adds up to £47 billion. So that's almost in line with the £40 billion figure that we are hearing. So all that doesn't have to be raised through tax necessarily. There could be spending cuts as well. And as we've been hearing from Nick, it looks like they are trying to find some spending cuts from certain departments. That may be because they're spending some more money on the NHS, which is so big that it kind of crowds out everything else. So it looks
which is obviously a protected department.
A protected department. So there may still be a squeeze on those unprotected departments.
We were warned about this during the election campaign.
Well, Vic, during the election campaign, as you say, Rishi Sunak stood up in front of the British people, as our former Conservative candidate and our Labour candidate will remember, and he said Labour will raise taxes beyond what they're claiming. Labour say we made a very specific commitment, and here it is. Labour will not increase taxes on working people, which is why we will not increase national insurance, the basic, higher or additional rates of income tax or VAT. Now, as we found out this week, as Downing Street refused to deny that they may raise national insurance on employers, not employee, there was quite a lot of wriggle room in what obviously the Labour Party said in its manifesto. So what we have is the Conservatives saying, told you so, and what we have Labour is saying we were very specific that those three main taxes would not go up on working people. If you're complaining about other things, particularly capital gains tax going up, we were silent on that. So why don't we just get a flavour of what we heard during the election campaign?
Keir Starmer is going to raise taxes, but that's just the start, because there's a long list of other things that he needs to find the money for. So it's not just going to start and stop there. There are £2,000 worth of tax rises coming for every working family in this country. And as I said, he's saying to you he's going to raise taxes.
I do need to answer
that's not the start, and that's not the end.
We will raise specific taxes, and we've been really clear what they are. We've already dealt with the tax break on private schools. We want to end the non-dom status completely. I think that the super-rich should be paying their tax. I want to get rid of the equity loopholes that are there, again, for the super-rich. And I think the oil and gas companies should be paying their fair share towards our energy. So we will raise those, but we won't raise the others.
So if Rishi Sunak were here, he would say, look, I told you taxes will be going up. But Labour, at that point and to this day, absolutely rejects that Rishi Sunak idea that taxes would go up by £2,000.
We were also warned by various eminent public finance experts, weren't we?
The Institute for Fiscal Studies, Resolution Foundation, many others, and you challenged ministers on this programme about the fact that there was a conspiracy of silence because what they'd penciled in for public service spending settlements was just totally unrealistic given the state of those public services. And that's why what we're all talking about tonight really matters to people, Vic. You know, people who use the health service, education, local government, environment. These matter for people's lives, and these services are not in a good state. So this may seem very abstract, but actually it matters for people's lives, the decisions that are being made right now.
Yeah, OK. Let me bring in Steve Baker then and Rosanna Allen-Khan. Labour promise no return to austerity. It sounds like it could be the opposite in a couple of weeks' time.
Obviously, we can sit here and speculate all we like, but quite frankly, no one has seen the details of the budget, and it'd be impossible to have a crystal ball and look at it. What we do know is that under the Conservatives, we had 14 years of, quite frankly, financial vandalism, and we had mismanagement of spending. For example, if you look at the Home Office, the budget for asylum and border control was supposed to be 110 million, and then we ended up with 7.6 billion coming out of the public purse.
But
so Labour have inherited this huge black hole, larger than they thought they were actually going to, and now they have to make very unenviable decisions. But ultimately, you know, Sir Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves said that they were not going to raise taxes on working people, and I believe them.
OK, well, it will be interesting to get you back in 2 weeks' time to see if they do raise national insurance on employers.
Always happy to come back on.
Sorry?
Always happy to come back on.
Because the IFS, as you know, calls that a tax on jobs. Steve Baker, it was your Conservative government who created this problem, wasn't it? Not only with the 2 lots of national insurance cuts, which were unsustainable, but also because of poor budgeting over things like asylum in the Home Office.
Well, I think with asylum, excuse me, with asylum, it's
broadly
it's
speaking.
a fact that we've had a huge problem of illegal migration across the Channel.
Sure, and you didn't budget properly for it for the last however many years.
Well, I mean, I think that's a reasonable point to make, but we don't think we could reasonably forecast the number of boats which would come across the Channel.
No, fair enough.
And we tried to deal with that issue. And of course, the measures that we put in place have been repealed by the Labour Party.
Yes, but you also, the Jeremy Hunt also as Chancellor, gave 20 billion tax cuts. National insurance went from 12% to 8%. That was unsustainable. That's why you could argue Labour are having to put taxes up.
Well, I'd like to be really clear about this. As long as we all live, the fiscal situation is going to be extremely difficult. Anyone who has looked at the Office for Budget Responsibilities Fiscal Risks and Sustainability report will have seen this chart that shows spending soaring away because of age-related spending, with revenues stagnating, even at crippling levels of taxation.
So why are you giving £20 billion worth of tax cuts before the election?
It's not a decision that I took, but the problem we've got, which Keir Starmer faces, is if you want growth, you need to reduce taxes on capital. I mean, growth has got to come from the private sector. That means capital investment. It means making the UK the best place in the world to invest for a return.
Let me pause you there,
taxing returns is...
Sorry, do finish the sentence, I'm sorry.
Taxing returns is prejudicial to growth. We need the economy to grow, and that will come through capital investment in the UK.
Right, I'm going to put this quote to both of you, if I may. It's former Governor of the Bank of England, Mervyn King, who wrote this week, both major parties were irresponsible in either making or promising not to reverse cuts in national insurance contributions. Labour accepted those national insurance cuts. Do you accept what Mr King is saying?
I mean, that's his opinion, and he's welcome to it. I don't accept it. I don't believe that Labour are irresponsible. I believe that they have been dealt a very, very difficult card. And no one here has actually mentioned Liz Truss's disastrous mini-budget and the fact that the patients that I've been seeing over the last 14 years in hospital are actually unable to get the operations that they need. They're unable to feed their children. They're actually not able to get into work. You have children dying of diseases that could have been prevented. All of that as a result of financial decisions that were taken by the Conservative Party. Let's see what the budget shows, and I'm happy to have a conversation about that then when we know the facts.
I accept it. I accept it outright, yes, 100%. The truth is that for 100 years the state has grown and grown, and we have turned a blind eye to the fiscal unsustainability of age-related spending. And I have made speech after speech over 14 years. I've written a book, I catalysed and contributed to a documentary. But actually getting the message out there that we face disaster in the public finances is always unpalatable. I had the discussion with Rishi Sunak in front of about 30 MPs. He agreed with me that my fundamental thesis, which the OBR shows, was right. MPs' faces fell, and then somebody broke the mood by saying, but of course we can't solve it at this election. And that is always the problem.
So did you vote against those two national insurance rises?
In the end, I voted with the government while I was a government minister.
Right, it's easy to say this now, you're out, now you lost.
But Victoria, I've been saying this since my maiden speech in 2010, and you know...
You voted for these tax rises, which it now appears show that were unsustainable. Sorry, Nick, did you want to come back?
We all know the tensions of being a party politician and a government minister. No one can really accuse me of not running enough rebellions against my own party, but there just does come a point where you've got to show some discipline.
Or you could have resigned from your Northern Ireland post.
I could have done, but I had an important job to do there, which I'm proud of.
On the theme of those rebellions, which may possibly be related to Brexit, when Steve Baker was putting Theresa May under a lot of pressure to live a sort of a stronger Brexit, may I briefly mention what, you got it there, the OBR does mention in every fiscal forecast, which is that Brexit has delivered a 4% hit to GDP.
Yes, they have said that.
Which would be 40 billion in tax revenues, because it would be 100 billion.
Yeah, I'm aware of the allegation. What I would say, though, is that whenever that figure is used, you have to dig into where it's come from. And the fact-checkers should really get across this, because usually it's arrived at by comparing the output of what's called a computable general equilibrium model, which forecasts or produces a projection of what different policies would do to the economy. But even the proponents of CGE models, like the Treasury, in papers which I referred to when I answered a UQ on this back in 2017 or 18, when it came up when I was a Brexit minister, those CGE models do not themselves purport to forecast the future. And I would really ask fact checkers to go back to what the Treasury says about CGE models. You will find that they do not purport to forecast the future.
Okay.
And one of the problems is that the OBR end up relying on those models as if they were forecast.
I think in fairness, the OBR relies on a range of models, not just the model that you
But there's a serious problem.
I want to go back to Rosanna Allen-Khan, if I may. I just wonder, do you think anybody who voted for Labour voted for tax rises and spending cuts?
But we're talking about speculating on a budget that hasn't been announced yet.
Let's put that to one side. It's just a straight question. Do you think anybody who voted for Labour in July voted for tax rises and spending cuts?
In the manifesto, it was very clear that working people were not going to be taxed. That is what the Labour Party has said. That is what was in the manifesto. That is what people voted for, I believe. And I believe that we're going to see in the budget that the same thing will remain.
So no spending cuts?
I'm not going to speculate on a budget that hasn't happened. Ultimately, people went to the polls and voted against not being able to get into work. They voted against having their schools falling down around them. They voted against having their prisons falling down around them. And they voted against not being able to get the mental health support that they needed. And I would just like to be positive for a moment. I think a lot of good things will be coming in the budget. For example, I'm really pleased to see that the Labour Party are bringing back reform of the Mental Health Act, which we know to get people back into work, we know to get more money into our economy, we have to be supporting people with their mental health.
We're going to talk about
that a little bit later.
And they're going
to bring that back in this Parliament, and I'm hoping that we're going to see positive things like an investment in mental health, an investment in our NHS, an investment in social care.
We'll see. Let's have a look at some of the front pages. Some of them are going on the budget. Daily Telegraph, budget to be the biggest tax raiser in history. The Times, Reeves will raise capital gains tax on share sales. And the Eye, benefits are to rise by £1.50 a week as Reeves faces a Labour backlash. And that's obviously related to today's inflation figures. Right, we'll come back to you shortly. Right, let's talk about the jabs that were originally intended to treat diabetes, but that are now being used to help with weight loss. Today, medical experts are calling for an urgent review to ensure people in England can get Ozempic and Wegovy on the NHS. It comes a day after the Prime Minister said weight loss injections could boost Britain's economy by getting obese, unemployed people back into work. Let's talk to Daniel Susskind, who is a professor of economics at King's College, who argues the use of this drug could help save the NHS, his words, and Cherie Ferguson, who went from 23 stone to 11 stone after using weight loss injections. Hello, both of you.
Hello.
Welcome to Newsnight.
Thank you.
Cherie, an incredible transformation. How do you feel?
Absolutely amazing. Just to correct you, it's 11 stone 13 as of this morning.
OK, so, 11 stone 13,
thank you.
Fair enough.
Thank you.
Set the record straight.
Yeah.
But go on, has it, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but has it transformed your life?
100%. I am more fitter, I'm active, I'm present. I feel like I can really enjoy life now, and it was not the easy way out. I still have to do a lot of things that the average person has to do. I've got to watch my macros, I've got to exercise, I've got to make sure that I'm drinking right so that I don't have any side effects. But this for me was the very last resort before holding my hands up in defeat and going down the bariatric surgery route. Right. And that was something that I just was not prepared for.
And did you... They're injections, aren't they?
They are, yes.
Just explain to our audience where you inject yourself and how often you do it.
OK, so I'm currently on Mounjaro, which is licensed for weight loss in the UK, which is the medication that the government have been talking about this week. You can inject in your thighs, in your arms, in your stomach, and it is a 1 pen where you get 4 doses where you inject once a week.
Got you.
Yeah.
And how much is that, or did you get it on the NHS?
I unfortunately don't get it on the NHS. It's not funded within my area. It is in other parts of the UK, but unfortunately where I live it's a bit of a postcode lottery.
Right. Because your BMI has to be at a certain level before you can get it on the NHS.
To be really honest with you, you have to have a BMI of over 30, you have to have another comorbidity, but your trust needs to be able to fund it, and that is the biggest problem.
So how much have you spent on weight loss jobs?
I wouldn't even like to be able to hazard a guess.
What do you reckon?
It's 150, probably more than that, about £150 a month.
And how long
for
have
the
you been
19 months that I've been on it. Some would argue that bariatric surgery would be a good thing, but over the life of that through the NHS, I would end up costing the NHS even more money. And to be really honest, there are a lot of people who do not address the emotional side of eating, etc., who do have bariatric surgery through the NHS and do end up gaining the weight back. So this, to me, is a chance to actually change my lifestyle completely and make sure that I'm not going to be putting that weight back on when I get to where I need to be with this medication.
So, thousands of pounds, you estimate you've spent. Any side effects?
Not for me.
Okay.
Mainly because I am a little bit of a stickler for this medication. I make sure that I eat the right things. I try to steer away from processed food. I get as much exercise and as much hydration as possible.
The way it works is to suppress your appetite, essentially, isn't it? Long-term effects, obviously, we don't know about. Is that something that you worry about or not?
The long-term effects of being initially where I started from 26 stone 11. When I came to weight loss medication, I was 22 stone 8. What would have been my side effects and my lifelong effects if I'd have carried on in the same vein?
Daniel, you are arguing that these weight loss jabs should be much more widely available across the NHS. Why?
That's right. I mean, partly because I think more people should have this sort of experience. I mean, obesity for individuals is, not a pleasant experience, but it's also because of the cost of obesity to the NHS. It's estimated to be about £11 billion a year, so that's about 8% of the NHS budget each year goes on obesity or obesity-related illnesses. But there's also the productivity implications of obesity too. Obesity is there's lots of evidence to suggest that it's holding back our economy as well. So it's not just about these really powerful individual stories, it's about the NHS and it's about the economy as a whole.
Yeah. So obviously, Cherie's explained how expensive it can be. It's obviously expensive to the NHS, but what's the net cost when you take into account the cost of the jabs, as opposed to fewer people using the NHS for obesity conditions, or more people being able to get back to work because they've lost a load of weight?
Yeah, and there's a lot of uncertainty, and it's important to be upfront about that. And one of the things that I think is really important is that we pilot an experiment and try and find out more. One of I think the biggest uncertainties is the effect that these drugs are going to have on obesity at a sort of overall level. I mean, one of the thing that really caught my attention in the last few months was what's happened to obesity in the United States. Tripled since the 1980s, and yet last year, for what seems to be the first time, it seems to have fallen. And people, there's a lot of uncertainty about why, but the most compelling reason is the fact that 1 in 8 people now in the States have tried these weight loss drugs. And in trials, we know that people lose on average about 15% of their weight, up to 20% of the weight. But this is the kind of evidence and data we need. We need to know what the effects are going to be on individuals and the demand for NHS and whether it gets people back to work.
I mean, again, we're early days. None of us knows the long-term effects. But how do you think these injections compare to other interventions like the sugar tax or prescription gyms or gastric band surgery? Do we know the answer to that yet? I
think an important starting point is that every government since about 1992 has said obesity is incredibly important to us. There's been about the Institute for Government did this really interesting survey, about 14 health strategies since 1992, more than 650 policy recommendations, exactly the sorts of things you're describing, nutritional advice, diet advice, sugar taxes, and yet obesity overall in Britain has just continued to rise. So I think we need to look at this technology, and it really is a technology, these jabs, with the same kind of excitement and enthusiasm that lots of people have about, artificially intelligent medical diagnosis or virtual wards. It's the same sort of category of thing.
Okay. I wonder what proportion of the UK might be on these weight loss jabs in, say, 5 years' time. I mean, you talk about 1 in 8 in the US who've used them. What were you going to say, Cherie?
I would say a large portion. I think that the main problem at the moment is there is a lot of people that are out there at the moment that qualify for this medication, that have the comorbidities, but unfortunately they have no access to this medication. And I admit that I am very privileged. I work and I've always worked and I've funded this journey myself. However, there will be people on a low income that do not have this access, and a lot of them are working. I don't understand how you would be able to police something if you were going to give these jabs to get people back into employment so it can boost the economy. I think it's really naive and it's missing the point, because there's so many long-term unemployed out there who do not want to work. So it doesn't matter what you give them or what you dangle in front of some people. If they're not going to want to work, they're not going to want to work, whether they're 15 stone, 100 stone, 2 stone, you know what I mean?
But it is something the government, as Keir Starmer was talking about, which could help long-term unemployed who were also obese back into the workplace. Cherie, thank you very much for telling us about your journey, as we say. Thank you. And thank you very much as a King's College professor for talking about the economics of it. Thank you. Thank you. So one of the things, as I just said, that the government is looking at in terms of trying to get people back into work. Another thing came from the Work and Pension Secretary today. And again, it's about cutting the welfare bill. Liz Kendall talks about the potential of jobs coaches going into hospitals. Have a listen.
Hearing things like, putting job coaches in hospitals. I mean, that sounds slightly surreal, doesn't it? I mean people are waiting for queuing for...
Absolutely not. Let me tell you, on just this week, in my own city, I went to an employment support service run by our mental health team. This is for people with serious mental health problems, serious. And the results of getting people into work have been dramatic.
Q. OK, so there's two things we want to talk about there. Job coaches going into hospitals. As an A&E doctor, Rosanna Allen-Khan, what do you think of that idea?
So I think it isn't a one-size-fits-all model when we're looking at people who are struggling with their mental health and actually getting back into work. Of course, I really support the idea that they can have help and support to get back into the workplace, to give back into the economy, have that sense of self-worth. But what we absolutely have to address is that the root cause of why they're struggling with their mental health, that has to be met. And also, there is very little point in going and coaching people back into getting a job and being in the workplace and being in the workforce if they are still on 2 or 3 year waiting lists for their mental health, if they're waiting diagnoses, and if their family are not getting the support.
OK, I'm just going to pause there because I'm going to bring our audience some breaking news, which is just coming into us here at Newsnight. We're hearing reports that a former member of One Direction, Liam Payne, has died after falling from the 3rd floor of a hotel in Buenos Aires. Now, this is according to the Reuters news agency, who are quoting local police. AFP are quoting the local newspaper. Liam Payne was 31. We're going to talk now to our music reporter, Mark Savage. Mark, what are you hearing?
Well, the same as what you've just said. Local police reports in Buenos Aires are saying that Liam Payne fell from the 3rd floor of a hotel in the capital and has been declared dead. Obviously, we don't have that 100% confirmed as of now, but very shocking news. He was only 31 years old and achieved global fame with One Direction, selling more than 70 million records and then scoring #1 hits on his own with songs like Strip That Down, which was written by Ed Sheeran, and had recently released a new single called Teardrops. So this is very unexpected news.
And if you want to carry on watching Newsnight, please turn over to BBC Two or watch on iPlayer.
Do stay with us here on BBC News for all the latest headlines in the US and around the world from the team here in Washington.